Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
Actually, good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
everyone. Thank you for joining us
in this webinar on the future of democracy in Tunisia
and the role
of the international community.
I'm pleased to welcome
four
excellent
panelists
today.
Two of them from
Tunisia,
Madame
Islem
Hamza,
who is
a lawyer,
human rights lawyer,
and an activist.
She's joining us from
Tunis.
Tunis.
And in few minutes,
Mr. Nejib
Mr. Nejib
the
Chebbi,
president of the
Salvation Front in Tunisia,
will also join us.
And we have also two
panelists
from Washington, D.C.
Actually,
one from Boston,
but who are
experts
in
international relations
and also closely following the situation in Tunisia.
Mr. José
Ignacio Hernandez
is a fellow or a visiting fellow at the Harvard School of Government,
School of Government at Harvard,
and
Mr. Eddy
Acevedo,
the Chief of Staff
at the Woodrow Wilson Center
for International Scholars.
We have a wonderful panel today, and we have translation also interpretation is available from English to Arabic and Arabic to English, back and forth. You can choose which language you want to hear by clicking on the button interpretation button at the bottom. So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all. مرحبا بك سي نجيب. تسمع فيا؟ سي نجيب تنجم تخدم ميكرو باش نسمعوك.
هكا تسمع فيا؟
Oui, très bien. So we will start with Mr. Nejib Chebbi and then Madame Islem Hamza. We'll give each one about 12 to 15 minutes. And then we will go to our experts here in Washington and Boston, José and Eddy, and also 12 to 15 minutes each one. And then hopefully we will have about half an hour for Q&A at the end. سي نجيب تفضل عندك حوالي ربع ساعة باش تعطينا المداخلة متاعك. مرحبا بك سي نجيب.
I greet everyone. According to the message I received from you, I've been asked to talk about the expectations, prospects for democracy in Tunisia, also regarding the unity of the opposition, the issue of the boycott of the elections, and the position of the international community on democracy in Tunisia, and finally our position as the Salvation Front on the IMF deal. Hence, I will try to deal with all these points. Regarding expectations, I want to say first that the Tunisian revolution did not occur in a vacuum. I personally had been persecuted by the National Security Court in 1981, regardless of our ideological, intellectual, and political differences. Our main agreement was on the implementation of Article 8 of the Constitution and demanding monitoring the constitutionality of law so that this article has some meaning. All the trials that took place since 1968 until the revolution, this was their central demand, to recognize the fundamental rights and freedoms of Tunisian citizens and to guarantee that, to establish a constitutional court that can monitor laws. Therefore, when the revolution came, it found trade unionists, political, civil rights elites that are fully convinced of the democratic project. And I believe that these were factors that facilitated the success of the Tunisian democratic transition, because the vacuum that took place at the top of the system was quickly filled by new political system, a new constitution, according to the consensus or near consensus of 200 MPs of the Constituent Assembly out of 217 members. This constitution recognized separation of powers, established a constitutional court, recognized rights and freedoms. There were several elections which were recognized as free and fair by those who took part, whether or not they won those elections, and by all international observers. Therefore, to talk about a black decade, as is now widespread, obviously, by the regime, has no meaning. Tunisia has lived 10 years of democracy, real democracy. If that democracy means freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of the media, elections, and all civil rights and freedom of thought, of course, then if democracy means these rights, in addition to institutions that establish separation of powers and that are based on legitimacy out of the ballot box, then I affirm, as an individual who was part of the opposition over the last decade for the governments that came after the revolution, and I was not part or a supporter of the policies that were implemented after the revolution. I testify that Tunisia lived a real democracy over the last 10 years. Unfortunately, there was a failure. If the elites had been culturally ready to establish a democratic political system, however, the repression and division and lack of communication prevented the elaboration of the political forces that could deal with the problems of society, the economic and social problems, and provide solutions for those problems. In the absence of these programs and visions for the economy and society, people were disappointed in the democratic transition because instead of improving their living conditions, those deteriorated to before the revolution, such that economically and socially matters under dictatorship were better. Hence, there was a reaction, a widespread social reaction against democracy as reduced to what is shown on TV of fights and disputes within parliament without any concern for people's concerns. People were angry, they were disappointed. Hence, Qais Said intervened to exploit the crisis, and he had been a major part of that crisis, and he worked to exacerbate the crisis by preventing the establishment of the Constitutional Court, by obstructing the work of the government during the pandemic, by preventing obtaining any vaccines and preventing the government from bringing vaccines. We can't now talk about all the examples of his obstruction and his provocative discourses that show him along with the army, which proved that he had been planning the coup. And on the 25th of July, 2021, he implemented his coup against democracy. He dissolved all institutions. He dissolved the government, which was illegal because the constitution does not allow him to do that. He dissolved parliament, which is an elected institution that has the same legitimacy that he claims for himself because they come from the same elections. He dissolved the higher judicial council, which was a major achievement on the path to the independence of the judiciary. He dissolved the Independent Commission for monitoring the constitutionality of laws. All that to establish an absolute authoritarian rule through presidential decrees like sultanic decrees or Tsarist decrees in Russia, which cannot be contested before the judiciary. And this is according to the law and to the text. These decrees cannot be contested before court, and these decrees cannot be monitored for their constitutionality because one of the institutions he had dissolved was the Temporary Commission for Monitoring the Constitutionality of Laws, and ended with abolishing the constitution to hold an electronic consultation, then a referendum over the constitution that he wrote himself without the participation of anyone. Even the consultative committee he had set himself rejected his constitution, and he was the only individual who wrote Tunisia's political system without consulting anyone. And he went forward to a referendum which he claims that 30% of Tunisians took part in, and everyone who knows in Tunisia knows that no more than 5% at the best of cases took part in that referendum. Based on that, he wrote his own new electoral law, and he is now preparing for elections on the 17th of December for a legislative council, which according to his constitution has no oversight powers over the executive. The legislative power, he also shares in that authority. He has the right to call for referendums. The sound is not clear. Was there anything that was not clear? I would like you to focus on the future in two questions. What are your predictions for these coming elections after around 10 days? Secondly, what is the role of the international community in your view? What do you ask of them to support Tunisian democracy? What is happening in Tunisia is clear. It is a coup against democracy. What is the future of democracy after this coup? I started by saying that the Tunisian society, the elites, since the 60s, were prepared culturally to establish a democratic system. And Tunisian society today is pluralistic, is diverse in the sense that there are many parties, there are trade unions, there are civil society organizations, there are academics, independent figures, and it is not possible for any system, for any setback to democracy to cancel all that. Secondly, I would like to point out that what Kais Saied has done has made him isolated internally. Now there is a consensus among all political and civil elites and academics and independents to oppose these tendencies and to call for a return to a system based on the separation of powers and that guarantees freedom. Hence, when Kais Saied started his power, he started with a sort of popular support because it was a reaction to what happened before the 25th of July. However, citizens have been fully disappointed in Kais Saied. And when I say disappointed, I mean that they do not expect anything from him, but they have not reached the point of rebelling against him because they do not believe that his departure, because public opinion is living through a crisis with the opposition and the political class as a whole. And they are focused on the social crisis, the rise in prices, the shortage of basic commodities, poverty. Therefore, citizens are not concerned about politics. Now, the political system regime is isolated completely internally, and it's suffering an external isolation. but the balance of powers has not reached the point, a turning point that can form a consensus within Tunisian society on change. There is still some life for this regime, but events are precipitating. One cannot predict what will happen in the near future because the social economic crisis is very acute and it's feeding the political crisis. We cannot predict how much time there is left for this regime, but things are moving in the direction not in this regime's interest. The second condition is the unity of the opposition. I may have talked for too long on the first point. Now, the opposition agrees on the diagnosis and the objective. They all agree that the goal is to end this coup and return to democracy. But what is missing is unity of the opposition. There is still division within the elites. As a result, not as a difference on the diagnosis, but because of the past. They are divided on the pre-coup experience, and there are the severe, mostly ideological rather than political divisions. And these inherited divisions from the pre-coup era is preventing the unity of the opposition. But matters are developing. Next Sunday, for the first time, there will be two protests. One led by the National Salvation Front and the second by 5 social democratic parties. And the two will meet at the Bourguiba Avenue, the Revolution Avenue in Tunis. So for the first time, without a united protest, these forces have agreed to meet on the same street to call for the same demands. So the unity of ranks has not been achieved yet, but what will happen on Saturday, yes, on the 10th of December is positive. What will happen is important, but it does not mean that we have gone beyond the state of division. I will end this point. I say that the future of democracy is clear because Tunisian society is diverse. Tunisia has now experienced authoritarianism and become convinced that it does not provide any solutions. The future is for democracy despite all the setbacks. Tunisia is experiencing a setback, and I personally believe we will be able to surpass that. I do not believe that will be far, but in any case, it is not possible to predict whether we will be able to have a national dialogue to establish a national salvation front to deal with the economic crisis, or there will be destruction. I am optimistic about the future of democracy because the forces on the ground are convinced, and those that oppose democracy are weakening by the day, but the pace of events cannot be controlled by anyone, and it is not easy to predict because it is accelerating. The last point, I rely on the international community. 1 minute, briefly, in 1 minute. States have values and interests, and it is possible that interests and values may be contradictory, and we take this into account and we prepare for it. What I say briefly is that the US position is important in its support for democracy. It did not hesitate since the first moment of the coup to emphasize the importance of the return to democracy. The European Union is not as clear in its position because of the geographical position, which makes it primarily concerned about political stability and the question of immigration that is increasing towards European shores from Tunisia and North Africa. Hence, the European Union, it is more concerned about stability. And what I believe personally is that dictatorship in a society like Tunisia, in such circumstances, cannot establish any stability. Only democracy can provide political stability. Not easily, but it is possible. Finally, I will not, if there is no time, I will, you have spared me talking about the French position, and I apologize. Thank you. We will return to that during the questions and answers. We will now go to Mrs. Islem Hamza. Welcome. You may speak Arabic or English as you wish. You have 15 minutes. I prefer to speak Arabic, but before speaking in Arabic, my intervention will be different from that, the context of Mr. Chebbi's contribution, because he represents a political opposition front, and I am a lawyer, an independent human rights activist. Hence, our views may be different between political actors and observers. I consider myself a political observer from the outside. It's even if I'm involved in the human rights activism, and I am part of many defense committees as part of many political trials before military courts and others, and other opinion trials, and the judicial persecution of MPs, lawyers, judges, journalists. This is important, and I must point that. However, this does not prevent me from considering myself as an observer, and I can say the following. I do not radically differ from what Mr. Chebbi, a fellow lawyer, has said. I start with my predictions. I am also optimistic, not because not as a superficial, but an objective conviction of studying other coups around the world, even if they last for years or decades. Today, political events are accelerated, and coups may only last years or months, particularly since it is clear for anyone who is living inside these coup regimes can simply and easily note that matters are very bad, and the way of managing the coup system is a failure. Perhaps if it had made use of the economic and political situation and made some achievements and used well the difficult economic situation in Tunisia and all the red indicators in Tunisia, unfortunately, I must say, fortunately for Democrats and unfortunately for Tunisian citizens in all cases, because they have been moving from bad to worse, we see that all indicators are going down and read complete failure to the extent that we say that all the coup authorities, the presidency, the government, with all its members, they bring one matter, as simple as it may be, and prove to us that you have been able to solve it. They are incapable of doing that. This makes the conditions, the circumstances Tunisians are living in to be very negative, but this means that it is difficult politically for this coup to last very long, because the same stick he has used, which is the difficulties Tunisians were living through, he exploited that to implement his coup against the democratic transition, because I say the democratic transition because I cannot claim that we were living in a full democracy. That is impossible. All the revolutions of the world lead to democratic transitions during which we tried as much as possible, at least formally, to hold elections where there are the main legal standards and conditions for Tunisians to express their opinions. And particularly during those years, there was a serious attempt to establish democratic institutions that would later exercise that democracy. Unfortunately, because those institutions of establishing democracy, in parallel, there was no kind of economic development or positive economic growth that Tunisians could feel. On the other hand, after this coup, it has become very clear that the shortcomings were in the political forces and civil society, with all its trends, failed to make Tunisians aware of the importance of democracy, for them to comprehend the meaning of that democracy. Unfortunately, after it was too late, everyone realized that after 10 years, where everyone was trying to establish institutions, but they were not concerned about the culture, the democratic culture of Tunisian citizens, because Tunisian citizens are the guarantee for the continuity of democracy. Hopefully this will be corrected when democracy is restored, but this is based on the first question about predictions, which may seem as dreams, but it's a reality. Since the political opposition, it is true that they are fragmented, although today, after 18 months of the coup, in the first or second month, we were a few dozen lawyers, activists, politicians who were conscious of the importance and meaning of democracy and rights and liberties, particularly those who had experienced dictatorship and experienced prison and violations before the revolution. But as for the rest of the political class and elites, we notice that although they changed their positions 180 degrees, where at the beginning they had supported the coup because they had seen the situation as catastrophic and calling for any change, or they had seen the coup as a means for change. I cannot judge their intentions, and I can judge, because you can either be a Democrat and follow democratic methods, but even if your intentions are good, you cannot, and if you wish to improve matters, if you use an undemocratic method, that is a coup, it would have been better for them as political elites to know that the end would be equally bad. History has no exceptions, and there are no coups that lead to positive results. Yes, it is true that not all revolutions are successful, and many countries achieve change through reform. However, coups, there are no exceptions. With the hundreds of coups throughout history, there is no exception that say that coups lead to reform. Hence, the result we have reached today, everyone with no exception is convinced of this failure and wants change. But where is the problem? The problem is political opportunism. I cannot blame them because any party wants to reach power and wants to have a place within the government, and that is the problem. Our political elites today cannot distinguish between the uniting national interest and their own interests of those parties. So we find, for instance, the 5 social democratic parties that Mr. Nejib Chebbi mentioned, they all agree. However, they still blame the rulers of the last decades and demand that they undertake revisions before they can work together. So this is how things are. Parties find themselves in this problem. If they put their hands in the hands of the National Salvation Front and that group, which is made primarily from parties that governed in the last decade, and everyone wants to blame that party, although everyone had taken part in that experience. But they think that if they put their hands in the hands of the accused, the main defendant in the eyes of the Tunisian people, then Tunisians will be angry, those who see that Islamist party to be responsible for what happened, and that they will lose their support in Nahda or allied parties. This is all political considerations because everyone is thinking about maintaining their social support. So their thinking is still based on political interests, as if we are still in the stage of sharing the spoils. The truth is that we are not at that stage. We are not. Because the country is in a state of collapse. So they should leave all those considerations related to elections and votes and government, and to move beyond that, to think at another level, a higher level, where the national interest is above everything, so that everyone can sit at the same table and to agree on a transitional plan simply for coming out of this coup, and later they can agree on a common project, which takes me to the second point regarding the predictions and expectations from the international community. Briefly, please. Regarding civil society, for me, there are no expectations, there are no specific. The international community, I since the coup, I have taken part in dozens of seminars, and we have talked to various parties from different regions and trends from different countries. What we reached today, particularly in this webinar with experts and policymakers, what we want to say is that academic knowledge, legal knowledge, human rights knowledge may bring people in those countries. This is what we need. We need, as opposition and resistance, and as lawyers, all the Tunisian elites need academic support, which may help us to build this project. There are no precise proposals that may be accepted. They are experts and they may propose what can be done in such a situation as Tunisia, because this is a coup like other coups. We describe it as a failed coup in Tunisia, but unfortunately it is continuing because the opposition is very weak. Had the opposition been at the required maturity, this coup would have collapsed very quickly. But the elites, which had got used to a certain mindset of opposing dictatorship, we cannot change them. This is our elite, this is our reality. We cannot get rid of them. Hence, we need knowledge exchange. And now, finally, in 30 seconds, regarding the new law, it is not possible to say about the IMF deal. We cannot ask for transparency or social growth. This is only $1.9 billion. This is a very small amount which will contribute to running the day-to-day running of the state, so it does not reach bankruptcy. But it's not a matter of oversight or monitoring. But another point on this specifically Tunisian coup, which is similar, which is different from coups in Africa or Latin America, where there is a military coup or group or a corrupt group. This is a different coup. This coup is unable, has no vision, no ability to achieve anything. It's not a problem of transparency or corruption. Believe me, I have no doubt that the president or his government will embezzle this money. The problem is the failure and incompetence of this government and inability to...
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much, Mr. Nejib Chebbi and Madam Islem Hamza, for two excellent presentations. And now we go to two American experts on international relations and on fighting dictatorships and coup d'etats and on supporting and defending democracy. So I'm very pleased to have with us today Mr. José Ignacio Hernandez. He is a scholar and an expert and also a politician from Venezuela who is also fighting a similar coup, you know, different circumstances, of course, but similar coup against democracy. And then we will have Mr. Eddy Acevedo, who has a long experience with US foreign policy in particular and how to promote and defend democracy abroad. So Eddy, you have the floor. I'm sorry, José first. José, you have the floor for about 12 to 14 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Radwan. It's such a pleasure to be at the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy to talk about the Tunisia situation that I have been following from a comparative perspective. And for that purpose, I will like to share with you this presentation. That has to do with what I have been calling the constitutional authoritarian populism. So my purpose here is to analyze Tunisia case from a comparative perspective and then suggest some strategies to protect democracy in Tunisia from the constitutional law and human rights perspective. Not so long ago, democracies used to die in military coups. However, one of the lessons that brings the 21st century is that democracies can also die in the hands of the constitution. So this is example of the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolás Maduro, who has been supporting his authoritarian measures in the Venezuelan constitution. So it is not weird in the 21st century that non-democratic regimes use the constitution to cover authoritarian measures. By the way, there is a very good book, a recent one by Moises Naim, The Revenge of Power, that explain from a political science perspective this topic. So we can, from a comparative perspective, and again, the lens of a constitutional law, we can talk about the modern dictator's playbook as master of constitutionalism, because there is a pattern that several non-democratic governments are following in the 21st century. And that playbook is based on basically 4 steps. Step number 1, the populist rhetoric, us versus them. Us are the people, them are the elites that are hindering the people's rights. For instance, it is necessary to protect the people against a corrupt Congress. It is necessary to protect the people against a corrupt judiciary. It is necessary to protect the people against a corrupt media, and so on and on. So there is a populist rhetoric that is used to justify an authoritarian pace. Second element in this playbook, constitutional formalities. This populist rhetoric is summarized in constitutional decisions. For instance, the most popular case, emergency decrees or exceptional powers, in order to protect the people against the risk created by the corrupt judiciary, the corrupt Congress, the corrupt media, the president adopts emergency decree to defend the people. Another popular institution here is the Constitutional Court that, because as you know, was not applicable, however, in the Tunisia case. So this populist rhetoric justify constitutional decisions that in essence are authoritarian. Why are authoritarian? Due to the concentration of power, the decimation of accountability, and human rights violation. So there is a big question here. Why modern dictators love the Constitution? And there are 2 reasons. One has to do with political science, and the second one is a legal reason. From the perspective of the political science, constitutions tend to provide legitimacy to political decisions. The Constitution is a source of legitimacy. So claiming that the dictator is acting under the scope of the Constitution is a way to reduce the political cost of the authoritarian decision. But second, from a legal perspective, these constitutional formalities are a shield against international oversight based on the non-intervention principle. Because modern dictators will claim that international organizations such as the United Nations Human Rights Council or the African Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Human Rights, etc., those international organizations cannot oversight domestic constitutional decisions based on the non-intervention principle. So basically, the Constitution is used as a shield to provide legitimacy and to reduce the role and intervention of the international community. And this is exactly what is happening in Tunisia. We can find here the populist rhetoric. President Zayed, as you know, claimed that he was protecting the people from a corrupt system, and as he called it, locks in the 2014 Constitution. He acted through constitutional emergency decrees. However, through this constitutional emergency decrees, President Zayed exerted absolute power and promote a constituent process that didn't follow the 2014 constitutional procedure. And finally, there is now a struggle between President Zayed and the African Court on Human People's Rights, because the African Court ruled that beyond the layers of constitutionality, the measures adopted by President Zayed violated human rights. So, and of course, the argument of President Zayed is that the African Court cannot overview domestic decisions adopted under the formalities of constitutional law. So as you can see, Tunisia, regrettably, is not an isolated case. On the contrary, Tunisia is the most recent example of the rise of constitutional populist authoritarianism. So just to end this brief presentation, how to restore, how to protect democracy in cases such as Tunisia from a constitutional law perspective. Well, there's some lessons that I can bring today, taking into consideration other similar cases. Lesson number one, it is necessary to look beyond constitutional formality. Each time that President Zayed claimed the constitutionality of his decision, it is necessary to explain why those decisions aren't constitutional. Second, the only constitution in force is the 2014 Constitution, period. The new constitution approved by Zayed is not a legitimate text, cannot be deemed or treated as a constitution. Third, register and denounce human rights abuses in order to promote accountability toward the international community. This is a long and winding road, but at the end, it creates favorable incentives for a democratic transition. Fourth, who are the people? It is necessary to rescue the people concept. The people is not a concept that President Zayed can manipulate. The people are defined in Article 3 of the 2014 Constitution. The Tunisia people that act through the legitimate representative government and through a referendum. And this moved to the final lessons. Only free and fair elections provide legitimacy. If President Zayed is using the Constitution as a way to gain legitimacy and avoid international accountability, therefore, it is necessary to denounce the gross violation of the Constitution by President Zayed and the gross violation of human rights in order to advance in an international accountability. So those are my very brief commentaries, and I will be happy to talk with you in the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jose. We now go to Eddy. Eddy, you have about 10 to 15 minutes. Please give us your opinion and suggestions on what the US is doing and what the US should be doing and what the international community as a whole should be doing to help restore democracy in Tunisia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. I agree with Jose Ignacio's assessment regarding the Constitution. I think it's very important that as we look at different leaders around the world, each one is using their Constitution and sort of rewriting the rules of the game in a manner in which to consolidate more power. But I'm just going to take a step back. I many years ago was the staff director of the Middle East subcommittee over in the House of Representatives. And back in 2015, we held a hearing regarding Tunisia's democratic transition. And in that time, both sides of the aisle, members of Congress, praised Tunisia for adopting a new constitution, electing a parliament, holding election, transferring power, even recognized the National Dialogue Quartet and the fact that they won the Nobel Peace Prize. So for many of us back then, we saw Tunisia as a success story that many of us hoped could be emulated in other countries or other countries within the Middle East. But I think it's important to recognize that democracy is more than just elections. Democracies also need to embrace citizen responsive governance, respect for human rights, ensuring strong institutions, protecting the rule of law, upholding a checks and balance system, obviously respecting constitutional order, and hoping to achieve some economic prosperity. So as we look at what has occurred in Tunisia, not only do we have this constitutional problem, but we'd also need to recognize and be upfront and honest about the feelings and the sentiments regarding Tunisians, right? Many Tunisians feel let down by the democratic transition. They expected that these new freedoms were going to give them economic prosperity, and that did not happen to their satisfaction. They were frustrated, obviously, with the elected legislative body. And that frustration was due to inflation, unemployment, corruption, COVID. But that was the sentiment that Zayed was able to tap into, which is why for many months, at least at that time, over 80% of Tunisians approved Zayed's actions. So when the international community comes out and condemns, Zayed says, wait a minute, I'm doing what the people want me to do. So I'm okay. But as we have learned from history and from different countries around the world, just because actions may be popular with the masses does not mean they're legal or democratic. I give the example of the United States. In the United States, the US Congress approval ratings are extremely low. That does not mean that the president of the United States can, on a whim, just dissolve the United States Congress. It's not possible. So, these are some of the things that we got to take a look at. Obviously, from a DC perspective, we have to see Tunisia in a greater context. I personally have a lot of concerns regarding authoritarians from outside the region who are having influence, specifically Russia and China. We've seen that Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has visited Tunisia before in the past, pushed for many agreements between both countries. And one of the biggest fears that I have is that Russia already has a port in Syria. And if they can set up shop in Tunisia, in my opinion, that undermines the free flow of goods and commerce through the Mediterranean. So that's something to be looking out for. And obviously, on the China front, we have seen that Tunis is seeking more investments from China, which could be problematic from a U.S. national interest perspective. On the economic side, this is also something that I think everybody needs to be looking at, regardless of who's in power and regardless of what the current government is doing or what the opposition wants to do. There needs to be a consensus on what is the plan to deal with the Tunisian economy. Unemployment is on the rise. I think it's close to 18%. Youth unemployment is even worse, around 36%. Back in 2004, there was the famous Tunisia youth bulge. which back then existed, which means now, folks are in their 30s and 40s, which is at the critical stage, obviously, when folks are trying to find a job. And, obviously we cannot forget that at one point, Tunisia had per capita the highest number of ISIS fighters. So from a security standpoint, it's something that we need to pay attention to. On the European Union side, obviously the EU is the largest economic partner to Tunisia, which is why I think there has to be a lot of collaboration between the US and the EU to make sure that we're working together to tackle this problem. From the US perspective, one of the things that we have in our tool belt is something that doesn't get much attention, which is a Tunisian American Enterprise Fund, which is an entity that is supported by the US government to support small and medium-sized companies, and has demonstrated some limited success in Tunisia, even during these difficult times. After I left Congress, I went to go work for USAID. And while at USAID, we elevated the presence of our operations in Tunisia. We had a very small office, and we upgraded that into a full USAID mission, which is something that I'm very much proud of. And this agreement gives the US just another leverage point that we can use when we're talking about Tunisia. Now, as Juan Ignacio pointed to the Venezuela example, I'm going to take that a little bit further. From a Tunisia standpoint, we saw President Zayed start ruling by decree. Well, we have seen in Haiti that ruling by decree is not a good way of doing business. We have seen Zayed reinterpret the rules in terms of the Tunisian constitution. We have seen that play out by dictators in Venezuela and Nicaragua, who have achieved and acquired more power through fraudulent elections, corruption, controlling the judiciary, ignoring the constitution, and disregarding the rule of law. So even though right now, one can make the argument that Zayed may not have gone as far as Ortega or Maduro, but these are some of the concerns that we are heading in that direction. Even in Chile, for example, Chile spent many years conducting a very inclusive process that heard a lot of input from its citizens regarding their constitution, something that did not happen in Tunisia. And even today, just a few hours ago in Peru, you see the example of President Castillo dissolving, even though he claims it's going to be temporary, dissolving his parliament and using it as an excuse to prevent a vote in accordance with the Peruvian constitution. And so far we'll see what happens, but many believe that this move by President Castillo is illegal. So these are something that we need to be looking into, not only from a Tunisia perspective, but how Tunisia fits globally. Now, in terms of recommendations from a US standpoint, so back in the day when Tunisia, as I said, first started to transition to a democracy, the US stepped in and granted Tunisia a major non-NATO ally designation. This is a very important designation that not many countries in the world have. And that is something that could be rescinded if things do not improve. At the same time, the US can provide incentives to try to change the behavior of the current government. We all know about the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They have been holding on a $500 million economic assistance package. And if we see some progress, that is something that we can use to improve the economic situation in the country. Obviously, we've discussed the IMF and the 1.9. I think it's very telling that the government asked for $4 billion and the IMF was only willing to give 1.9. But as this vote comes up this month, it'll be very telling to see if they condition any of this support and use democratic levers to condition the support. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, the Tunisian people have really proven to be resourceful. And history has shown us that Tunisians are equipped to find a political solution. In many countries around the world, people believe that the opposition cannot get together for a common cause. And Tunisia has proven that it did so once. And all of us are hoping that we can do that again, because we want Tunisia to succeed. And we need it to succeed. We've been very clear-eyed on trying to, in my opinion, do a bit of a carrot and stick approach to be able to incentivize good behavior. But ultimately, the US and the international community, they need to apply pressure now. I am one who believes that if we would have applied pressure after July 25th, maybe we wouldn't be in the position we are today. So time is definitely not on our side. We should coalesce around supporting democratic institutions and upholding free and fair elections under a legitimate, respectful, and inclusive process before the situation gets worse. The example that I give on some of the countries in Latin America, it tells us that we in the United States and the international community either acted late or did not act at all to prevent some of these catastrophes in Latin America. And we must not make that same mistake in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddy. We now have about half an hour approximately for Q&A. And I'd like to ask all of you, the panelists, a direct question about the IMF loan. Under these conditions, do you think that the IMF loan is a good thing for Tunisia, or do you think that it will hurt the chances for restoring democracy in Tunisia? And what conditions can be attached to this IMF loan to help Tunisia get back on the democratic process? I know that it's still under discussion and they still haven't really formalized or finalized the loan or the conditions attached to the loan. So I think if you have any kind of recommendations, any kind of suggestions, I think it would be very helpful and very timely. So the question is to all of you, but go ahead, Eddy, please.
So just real quickly, one thing I would like to note is, we have to be very careful here, right? Like, we want to make sure we help the people of Tunisia regardless, because we know that the situation in the country economically is not the best at the moment. Mm-hmm. So on one hand, we have to juggle helping the people, but at the same time, trying not to legitimize a undemocratic process. That's exactly really what's in front of us. So how
do we do that?
Right. So I do think there's a way for the IMF to condition the assistance, and in the assistance, build in some democratic reforms that money can be dispersed only after, X, Y, and Z happens. So I do think there's a way that we can help them help themselves. Because ultimately, we also need to think about what are the leverage points that we can use to change the behavior of the Zayed government. And the IMF loan is obviously one of those big levers that we can use.
Thank you. José?
Yes, and following Eddy's commentaries, I just want to share with you this lesson that in non-democratic regimes, economic crisis not always promote transition, quite the contrary. And in non-democratic regimes, economic crisis can increase the political power of the autocratic rulers. So for that purposes, I will suggest not to think on a binary solution, whether to grant or not to grant the IMF loan, but as Eddy suggested, to focus on the conditions that should be fulfilled in order to advance in this IMF loan, following general universal standards of democracy, accountability, and human rights.
Thank you. سي نجيب، شنو رأيك في موضوع القرض متاع صندوق النقد الدولي؟ ويعني هل هو سيساعد على الانتقال الديمقراطي أم لا؟ الصوت سي نجيب عن الميكرو.
لا
توا واضح. هاي
لا واضح. طيب، قلت لك الإصلاحات اللي يطلبها صندوق النقد الدولي ضرورية جدا، لأن تونس تعيش عدد من اختلالات في التوازن، عجز في ميزانية الدولة وعجز في الحساب الجاري. يعني أنه دون إدخال إصلاحات لا يمكن للتوازنات الاقتصادية الكبرى أن تعود. فنحن لا نناقش ضرورة هذه الإصلاحات، نحن نقول أن هذه الإصلاحات لها كلفة اجتماعية كبرى وتأتي في ظرف أزمة. إذا لم تكن هذه الإصلاحات محل توافق بين القوى الاجتماعية والقوى السياسية حتى يتفق على كيفية إجراء هذه الإصلاحات، لأن الإصلاحات لا يمكن أن تتم بين يوم وليلة، لابد أن تتخذ حيز زمني معين، ثم لابد أن يكون لها العديد من الإجراءات المرافقة لحماية المتضررين من هذه الإصلاحات إلى آخره. دون توافق هذا البرنامج، تطبيق هذا البرنامج، أخشى أنه يعيد إثارة ما أثاره في نهاية السبعينات بداية الثمانينات في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، ثورة الخبز في المغرب وفي تونس وفي مصر، كانت نتيجة قرارات مسقطة في رفع الدعم عن هذه المادة الأساسية. لذلك نحن نقول أن الاتفاق مع النقد الدولي ضروري إذا ما كان هو بين هذا الصندوق وبين حكومة لها سند من القوى السياسية والاجتماعية، ثم أنه هو زهيد، يعني 1.9 مليار دولار، وسيصرف على 8 أقساط، وكل قسط يشترط أن يتم فيه رزمة من الإصلاحات بقطع النظر على كلفتها في هذا الظرف. فأولا هو مبلغ زهيد، لكنه سيفتح إمكانية الدعم الدولي، يعني أن الاتفاقات الثنائية مع الإمارات، مع السعودية، مع بعض الدول الأخرى التي تريد أن تمنح تونس قروض، هذا الاتفاق سيفتح هذه الإمكانية. لكن من يعلم الأزمة الحقيقية في تونس هي أزمة هيكلية ومزمنة. الأزمة مع صندوق النقد الدولي لا تعود إلى ما بعد انقلاب قيس سعيد، هي منذ حكومة الشاهد في سنة 2019 صندوق النقد الدولي أوقف أقساط القروض التي تعهد بإسدائها إلى تونس، لأنه رأى بأن الاقتصاد التونسي يمشي في اتجاه خطأ. إذن ما أقول أن هناك إصلاحات هيكلية أساسية لابد أن تستجيب ليس فقط إلى توازنات ميزانية الدولة، هذه مسألة هامة، ولكن أيضا كيف يمكن تنشيط الاقتصاد، كيف يمكن دفع الاستثمار، كيف يمكن دفع التصدير حتى تخلق الثروات وحتى يخلق مواطن الشغل. هذا لن يحله صندوق النقد الدولي، هذا تحله حكومة مقتدرة كفءة لها دراية بالوضع في تونس ولها دعم واسع من التونسيين. ولذلك أنا أعتبر بأن الاتفاق مع صندوق النقد الدولي يعني لا أنتظر أنه يكون فيه قيود سياسية، أنا لا أدري، أعرف بأن القرار هو سياسي، والقرار بالدرجة النهائية هو في يد الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، لأنها عندها عدد من يعني حجم نسبة مئوية من الأصوات بإمكانها أن تعطل قرارات المجلس، لكن إذا ما لم تعطله فسيسير. أنا لا أنتظر شروط سياسية من صندوق النقد الدولي، وإذا كانت هذه الشروط هي لدعم الديمقراطية فمرحبا بها.
شكرا جزيلا.
بالله لحظة، مدام أعطيتني نعمل توضيح وحيد. الأستاذة إسلام استمعت لها بغاية الانتباه، وفي الحقيقة ما ريتش الفرق في التحليل العام بين ما يقوله السياسي وما تقوله الناشطة المدنية. ولكن حاجة حتى لا يذهب في أذهن المستمعين بأن كل الطبقة السياسية أيدت الانقلاب، هذا ليس صحيح. هناك من وقف في وجه الانقلاب منذ 25 جويلية، وهناك من وقف قبل 25 جويلية، وأنا شخصيا في 19 أبريل صدرت تدوينة أحذر فيها من انقلاب زاحف بناء على ما كان يجري. ولذلك هذا فقط حتى لا يظن بأن الطبقة السياسية كلها تبحث على مصالحها الحزبية وليس لها ثقافة ديمقراطية وإلى آخره، ولا تضع المصلحة الوطنية في الدرجة الأولى. هذا كله انتقادات معروفة من نشطاء حقوق الإنسان، فيها جانب من الحقيقة ولكن ليست كل الحقيقة.
شكرا سي نجيب. إذن عندنا سؤال من باش ناخذ بعض الأسئلة من الحاضرين. السيد سبتي مولهي يسأل so a question from one of the audience for the guests. It seems that youth new organizations formations, that there are new organizations formed by the youth, are practically unified and their actors are fluently interacting with each other despite the presence of different ideologies within these structures. How can the Salvation Front and the democratic parties fuse with these youth formations, acting both at the levels of the civil society and the political spheres in order to resolve incompatibilities between them? Could you please provide a strategic general vision about this important fusion? And the second question is, how can the United States and the international community support these new youth formations? Would you see any practical ways of this potential support? So I think the question is really that a lot of Tunisians are upset and disappointed with what they call the political elites, and especially with political parties. And now there is a vacuum of political parties that can fill in the void, or even political organizations that can fill in the void and can mobilize the people and can give them a vision for the future. How do we move that? How do we encourage young people to become more active, to become, to take the lead in creating new political parties or new civil society organizations, and to fill in this void or this vacuum? Or is this vacuum natural? Is it normal that when you have a coup, that there is a vacuum of political, leadership and political, and there is a crisis among the political parties? Go ahead, Eddy, please.
So I think there's two ways of answering this question, and fundamentally, both sides have a responsibility. The youth have a responsibility to organize and to come up with some concrete action items or concrete initiatives that they believe are needed in the country. And that responsibility is on them. I think a lot of times the youth, they very much like to complain a lot. They don't like this, they don't like that. But we need to take that and turn it into a positive message for activism in a democratic way. So the youth have a side of the responsibility. At the same time, civil society and political parties, they have a responsibility to give the youth a seat at the table and make sure that their voices are being heard. So I do think there's two sides to this. One quick thing on the IMF that I just wanted to say, it's important if you can do some conditioning of democratic reforms. It's also important on the timing of such events. Again, using the Venezuela example, just last week, sanctions were lifted on Venezuela regarding their oil sector on a promise that later they will have conversations regarding democratic reforms. Now, I can make the argument, once you give Maduro what he wants, what incentive is there later for him to come back to the table and give some kind of a democratic pathway to the opposition. So I believe that, you know, any conditionality must happen and be structured in a way where the action on the regime side sort of comes first, and then everybody else can respond and as they see fit. But to give these leaders everything they want based on the hope that they will find it in their hearts to come around, I just think is not a fruitful way of operating.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else wants to answer that question about the role of the youth in political parties, and whether there is an opening for young leaders, new young leaders in Tunisia to emerge? تفضل إسلام، تفضل.
النقطة اللي نأكد عليها أنه عموما في الممارسة السياسية خلافا ممارسة النشاط المدني المنظماتي، هو الشباب بحاجة إلى تأطير في إطار أحزاب سياسية ربما تساعدهم على القيام بأدوارهم، لأنه لا يمكن أن الإنسان من لا شيء يكون حزب ويصبح قادر على الفعل وتصبح عنده رؤية. هذا أمر مستحيل. يعني الحل الأول هو أنه الأحزاب السياسية الموجودة في إطار مؤتمرات انتخابية وشرعية تحاول القيام بمجهود لتجديد قياداتها ولجعل الشباب المؤثر داخل هذه الأحزاب لممارسة العملية السياسية، مراقبتهم وتأطيرهم وخاصة مساندتهم. هذه النقطة الأولى. الإمكانية الثانية صعبة جدا في تونس. لماذا؟ على الشباب وعلى غير الشباب، لأن المشكلة السياسية في تونس هي مشكلة ثقة. نجاح الانقلاب هو في الأصل يعود إلى غياب الثقة بين الطبقة السياسية وبين الشعب التونسي، واستغل رئيس الجمهورية هذا الأمر بما أنه لا ينتمي من المفروض للطبقة السياسية وبصفته كأستاذ مستقل، واغتنم تلك النقطة ودخل منها إلى عالم السياسة واستغل عدم ثقة المواطن التونسي في السياسيين. الإشكال حسب بحضور أستاذنا السيد الشابي، والذي يعلم الجميع أنه أستاذ مناضل من زمان، وكل الطبقة السياسية في تونس لابد من التوضيح. أغلبيتها التي تعارض الانقلاب اليوم لا يمكن أن نقول أنها طبقة ضد الديمقراطية مثلا، هذا غير صحيح، وهذا لا تقوله المنظمات المدنية كما بدا ربما لأستاذنا. ولكن هناك فرق لم يتمكن السياسيون من فهمه، وهو الفرق بين حقيقة هذه النخبة، حقيقة تجربتهم ومراكمتهم للنضال ضد الاستبداد منذ عشرات السنين، يعني فعلهم السياسي الحقيقي، ومن جهة أخرى البراند، التقييم، الانطباع الحقيقي لدى الشعب التونسي. الانطباع الحقيقي هو أن السياسيون عن بكرة أبيهم هم أناس انتهازيون وغير جديرين بهذه الثقة، وبالتالي في تونس ولتجاوز هذا الانقلاب ولاسترجاع تلك الثقة بين السياسيين والمواطنين التونسيين لابد من بناء هذا الجسر. كيف؟ لابد على السياسي أن يتساءل: كيف يمكنني أن أجعل التونسيين بعيد الانقلاب أو مش انقلاب يثقون بي؟ هذا هو السؤال، ليس تلك الوضعية والبوزيشن الدفاعية. هم لا يفهمون أننا مناضلون، هم لا يفهمون أننا ديمقراطيون. نحن ديمقراطيون منذ الأزل، نحن منذ البداية قلنا أن هذا انقلاب ونحن. نعم، أنا أقول هذا صحيح، ولكن هل هذا هو الانطباع لدى الشعب التونسي؟ لا.
شكرا إسلام. شكرا. تفضل سي نجيب، عندك رد أو تعليق على هذا السؤال؟
لا، أعتقد أن الموضوع اللي أثاره السي المولهي والموضوع اللي طرقته الأستاذة إسلام يطرح مشاكل عميقة في المجتمع التونسي. لا يهم الانقلاب، سابق الانقلاب وسيظل بعد الانقلاب. الطبقة السياسية قبل الثورة لم تكن أحزابا سياسية، كانت كلها مجموعات إيديولوجية، إسلام على قومي على شيوعي، حتى أدعياء حقوق الإنسان كانوا مطلبيين احتجاجيين لا يمثلون فكرا ولا معرفة بالسياسة. فلما وقع الفراغ اضطرت هذه المجموعات الإيديولوجية بأن تحتل السلطة، وفشلت في إدارة السلطة لأنها لم تكن مهيئة. وما دامت الطبيعة تأبى الفراغ فأصبحت التموقعات والتحالفات والانقلاب على التحالفات هو الذي يسير الحياة السياسية، وخلق نفورا عظيما من هذه الطبقة السياسية. وما تقوله بأن الشعب التونسي فعلا له ردة فعل حادة إزاء السياسيين جميعا صحيح، لكنه يدل على هناك أزمة في المجتمع التونسي، ليست فقط في النخبة التونسية، لكن المجتمع التونسي لم يتسنى له، لم تتيح له التجربة التاريخية حتى يكون له تصور آخر. بالنسبة للشباب أنا سأكون صريح، شخصيا أؤمن بالشباب، وأعتقد أن تونس لم تتحرر إلا لما أتتها مجموعة قليلة حول بورقيبة من ناس عمرهم في العشرينات، ودفعوا جانبا كبارهم وفتحوا طريق للتحرر. زرت العديد من البلدان الديمقراطية منها الولايات المتحدة وبريطانيا، ويعني رأيت بأم عيني كيف أن هذه الأمم الراقية تعتمد على الشباب وتدمج الشباب من خلال التجربة المباشرة. ليس هذا مجال ذكرها، لكن لم ألحظ في هذه البلدان صراع بين الأجيال. الشباب في تونس هو الذي قام بالثورة، لكنه لم يكن مهيأ إطلاقا لتلك الثورة، وأول من فوجئ بالثورة هو الشباب، فعاد إلى بيوته واحتل الشيوخ المقاعد الأولى في الحياة السياسية. ثم خلينا نقول بوضوح وبأسف أن الشباب الآن نافر من السياسة نفورا مطلقا منذ على الأقل 10 سنوات منذ الثورة، انسحب من حقل الفعل العمومي وأصبح يغذي ردود فعل عامة ضد السياسيين. ثم الأزمة التونسية أن الشباب نفر بلده. الآن الشباب له طموح واحد، حلم واحد، هو هجرة البلاد التونسية. فالمسألة معقدة أكثر بكثير حول تكوين الشباب أو فتح المجال أو الأفيرماتيف أكشن اللي عملناها في المجلس التأسيسي لفئة المرأة ولفئة الشباب. لا، هناك أزمة، لابد الشباب حتى يأخذ دوره. الحيوية لا تكفي، لأن الحيوية يمكن أن تصرف في اتجاهات أخرى. يجب أن يكون هناك خيال، أن يكون هناك مشروع، أن تكون هناك معرفة، أن تكون هناك كفاءة. فعندها سيشق الشباب طريقه ويفتك المشعل من كل الأيادي دون الدخول في صراعات الأجيال.
شكرا جزيلا. عندنا سؤال. We have another question from Alex Sutton from Tunis. Subject is the military. Can Eddy comment on considerations for and how on if to support the military? Can José talk about how efforts went in Venezuela to find reasonable elements in Maduro's FANB, and can Mr. Chebbi talk about the likelihood of the Tunisian military reassessing their position or their stand vis-a-vis Qais Said? I think Eddy unfortunately had to leave. He had another commitment. He had to leave. He just left. So we'll go to José for maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes and tell us about Venezuela's experience. And then Mr. Nejib Chebbi سي نجيب السؤال هو حول دور واضح. اوكي تفضل. اذا هوزي 2 minutes please.
Yeah, of course. Any authoritarian regime needs to exert some degree of control and repression. Even the menace of repression to maintain power. And therefore, in any authoritarian regime, military and police forces tend to be one of the pillars of support. And for that purpose, it is necessary to clearly understand what is the mission of military forces. If we have a military force that has been organized based on institutional arrangement with the objective to protect the Constitution, defend the people, and there is a strong army in that sense with strong capabilities, then the army can be a tool towards democracy. But if the capacity of the army is weak, if there is no clear mission, if armies rule under patrimonial arrangements that includes illicit activities such as corruption, therefore the army will be a tool towards authoritarianism. And that was precisely what is happening in Venezuela. Since Hugo Chávez's policies, the institutionality of the army was destroyed, and currently the army is nothing more than a sort of guerrilla or lords or a non-institutional organization based on personal and patrimonial arrangement. And therefore, the lack of an institutional army is one of the constraints that Venezuelan people are facing towards a democracy. So I will say that, to summarize, it will depend whether the army has strong capabilities as an objective institution or whether the army is organized as a Praetorian guard of the presidency based on subjective and patrimonial arrangements.
سي نجيب.
طبعا أنا سأتكلم على تونس.
طبعا.
أولا هناك سمة مهما كانت أسبابها ومهما كان ما يمكن أن تثير من نقاش. الجيش في تونس التزم منذ الاستقلال الحياد السياسي، لم يكن له دور في الحياة السياسية، استنجد به بورقيبة في وضعية أو 2 ولكن لم يلعب دورا في الحياة السياسية. 2 الجيش دعم بشكل خافت انقلاب قيس سعيد، اعتبره رئيس الجمهورية الشرعي، وتأويله لفصل 80 لم يكن مهيأ الجيش للدخول فيه، لكنه ساند المسار، سانده عند الميلاد. منذ ذلك الوقت الجيش على الحياد، متحفظ، لا يتدخل في الحياة السياسية. الجيش الآن في بلد، هذا البلد أوضاعه الاجتماعية تتطور بشكل خطير في اتجاه الاضطراب وعدم الاستقرار. الجيش سيجد نفسه مختار في يوم من الأيام إما أنه يواجه المواطنين باسم حفظ النظام، أو أنه يدعو النخب السياسية والمدنية التي عجزت على الاجتماع إلى الاجتماع للاتفاق على مخرج من تونس. لا أعتقد بأن تونس ظروفها، تركيبتها التعددية، طبيعتها المدنية تسمح بقيام نظام عسكري، ولا أعتقد أن العصر يسمح بقيام نظام عسكري. يمكن للجيش إذا ما اضطر في حالة قصوى أن يلعب دور ليس لأخذ الحكم وإنما لجمع التونسيين حول مائدة واحدة ليتفقوا على الإصلاحات وعلى حكومة إنقاذ تكون لها سند عريض. هذا ما يمكن أن يقوم به الجيش، وهذا لن يختاره الجيش من تلقاء نفسه، ستضطره إليه الأزمة الاجتماعية المتفجرة.
شكرا جزيلا سي نجيب. عندي سؤال أخير من السيد إبراهيم الحصري من لبنان. I have one final question from a colleague, Mr. Ibrahim Al-Husari from Lebanon. And his question, which I've already answered online, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to answer you at the conclusion of this webinar. Why do the panelists keep repeating the term coup d'etat? Leave the elected president end his term. Let him end his term. He was elected after all. The problem is not in President Said or with President Said. It is in the political life in Tunisia and the way people are mobilized well to make for their future. So I hope the question is clear. Why do you consider this a coup d'etat? And why not let him end his term? He was elected by the people, and let him finish his term and let him do what he can and implement his vision for Tunisia. So maybe we'll end it with concluding remarks. We start with José and then with Islam, and we will end with Professor Chebbi. Ustad Ahmed Nejib Chebbi will have the final word. So José, please go ahead. Why do you consider this a coup d'etat?
Thank you so much. As I explained in my presentation, one of the lessons of the 21st century is that democracies die by the winners of elections. And this is not only the Tunisia case. There is an election commonly under a political and economic crisis. A charismatic and populist leader is elected. And once this charismatic president is elected, started a slow motion process to decimate the rule of law. The only difference or particularity in Tunisia's case is that it was not a slow motion process. On the contrary, it was very abrupt decisions adopted by President Said that violated the constitution. Democracy should be protected even regarding democratically elected governments. Otherwise, democracy and human rights will be impaired. And this is why we can't talk about a coup d'etat regarding elected government. And by the way, from a comparative constitutional law perspective, there are too many cases that demonstrated that coup d'etat, gross violation to the constitution, can be committed by elected governments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, José. Islam, ما زلت معنا؟
أنا معكم. نقطة أخيرة متعلقة بالانقلاب.
ممكن تخدم الفيديو.
الفرق هو أنه الرئيس عموما في الانقلابات يأتي المنقلبون يعني على رؤوس دبابات ربما، أو يأتي من بلدان وراء البحار، ولكن هذا الرئيس كان انتخب بطريقة ديمقراطية وشرعية تونسية. ولكن الانقلاب هو انقلاب على الشرعية الديمقراطية، لأن رئيس الجمهورية صحيح انتخبه التونسيون، ولكنهم انتخبوه بمقتضى عقد، والعقد الذي يربط ذلك الرئيس والذي أقسم على احترامه هو دستور 2014 الذي صوت عليه 99% من الشعب التونسي وممثليهم. ولكن هذا الرئيس بعدما أمضى على ذلك العقد وأقسم على احترام الدستور التونسي والذي هو مضطر للعمل على أساسه، فإنه رمى بذلك الدستور وخرقه وأغلق بدبابة البرلمان وهو المؤسسة الشرعية الأصلية للشعب التونسي، وأغلق جميع المؤسسات الدستورية القضائية مراقبة الفساد كل المؤسسات، وأرسى بمفرده دستورا هو فقط حرره وأعطى لنفسه سلطة مطلقة. ربما لو اتفق الجميع على أن تونس لا يصلح بها نظام برلماني بل نظام رئاسي، ربما كان التونسيون سيتفقون على ذلك. ليس الإشكال هنا، ولكن الإشكال أنه أرسى دستورا جديدا وحطم جميع المؤسسات الشرعية الدستورية المنتخبة، وأرسى هيئة عينها شخصيا بنفسه لتقوم بهذه الانتخابات الكرتونية المقبلة، ثم أعطى لنفسه في هذا الدستور صلاحيات فرعونية لا حدود لها. لا حدود لها، لا أحد يراقبه، لا أحد يسائله، لا أحد يحدد له شيئا، هو يحكم في كل شيء بدون أدنى مساءلة. وبالتالي سيدي كيف لا تريد أن نقول أنه انقلاب؟
شكرا